Have you ever wondered what would happen if you couldn't pay your debts in the past centuries? Let's journey back to a time when the inability to pay one's debts could have dire consequences. We're talking about the dawn of debtors' prisons in Western Europe. The concept of debtors' prisons may seem archaic to us now, but they were a widespread reality from the Middle Ages up until the mid-19th century. These institutions were essentially a form of punishment for those unfortunate enough to fall into debt. If you were unable to pay your debts, you faced incarceration until you could work off your debt or secure funds to pay it. Now imagine being locked up, not for committing a crime but simply because you were unable to meet your financial obligations. It was a grim reality for many individuals during those times. These prisons were not just places of confinement, but often, they were literal death traps. The conditions were abysmal, with overcrowding and disease running rampant. Many debt prisoners often succumbed to illnesses before they could even clear their debts. The Middle Ages were particularly notorious for the prevalence of debtors' prisons. During this time, the prisons were rife with diseases, and many debtors often died before they could repay their debts. This dark chapter in history serves as a stark reminder of the lengths societies went to in order to enforce financial obligations. Fast forward to the 19th century, these prisons varied in the freedoms granted to debtors. In some cases, inmates were even allowed to live outside the prison, a stark contrast to the harsh conditions of centuries past. However, the core principle remained the same. If you couldn't pay, you stayed. So, as we delve deeper into this topic, let's remember the harsh realities of those who lived in a time when financial insolvency could cost you your freedom, and often, your life. These prisons were literal death traps for the poor, who were unable to pay their debts. So, what was life like inside these prisons, you might ask? Well, it was a grim existence to say the least. Debtors' prisons, as they were known, were a place where people who couldn't pay their debts were incarcerated. It was a system that, oddly enough, varied greatly in its execution. In some places, the conditions inside these prisons were harsh, to say the least. Overcrowding was common, and diseases often ran rampant. The prisoners were expected to work off their debts, but the conditions made it a Herculean task. The food was scarce and often of poor quality. The lack of sanitation and medical care meant that many debt prisoners died before they could repay their debts. But in a peculiar twist, not all debtors' prisons were alike. In some instances, debtors were granted certain freedoms. In England, for instance, some prisons permitted inmates to live outside the prison. Yes, you heard that right. These inmates, despite being in debt, could continue to live in the outside world, although under strict surveillance. This system, while granting some freedom, also had a profound impact on the prisoners and their families. The burden of debt was not only a personal issue, but also a family one. The family members of the debtor often bore the brunt of the debtor's imprisonment, as they were left without financial support. Moreover, the psychological impact on the debtors was immense. The shame and stigma associated with debt imprisonment were enough to break the strongest will. It was a system that was not just punitive but also a form of social control. It served to reinforce the divide between the rich and the poor. Debtors' prisons were not just punitive, they were a form of social control, reinforcing the divide between the rich and the poor. But how did society move away from such a harsh practice, you might ask? Well, the abolition of debtors' prisons was not an overnight event. It was the result of tireless efforts by many reformers, and a shift in societal understanding of debt and financial hardship. One of the most influential figures in this movement was none other than the celebrated author, Charles Dickens. Dickens had a personal connection to the issue. His own father was a debtor prisoner, an experience which deeply affected him. Dickens used his platform to advocate for the rights of the indebted, weaving tales of debt and despair into his narratives, thus bringing the harsh realities of debtors' prisons to the public eye. Yet, it was not until the Debtors Act of 1869 that significant legal changes were made. This act limited the ability of courts to sentence debtors to prison. The impact of this act was immediate, leading to a drastic decrease in the number of debtors imprisoned. However, it was not the end of the fight against debtor incarceration. The true death knell for debtors' prisons was the changes in bankruptcy laws. These laws began to reflect a new understanding of debt, not as a moral failing that deserved punishment, but as a financial hardship that could befall anyone. Bankruptcy was no longer seen as a crime but a legal status, a tool for individuals and businesses to resolve their debts and begin anew. This shift in perspective, combined with the legal reforms, led to the global abolition of debtors' prisons. From the Middle Ages to the mid-19th century, These prisons were a common sight in Western Europe, but today, they are a relic of the past, a dark chapter in our history lessons. The abolition of debtors' prisons marked a significant shift in the way society handled debt and financial hardship. It was a testament to the power of public sentiment, the influence of reformers, and the evolution of legal systems. It was a victory for humanity, a step away from punishment and towards understanding and compassion. So, what's the legacy of these debtors' prisons? Well, even though the practice of imprisoning individuals for their debts has largely been abolished worldwide, the echoes of this system can still be heard today. In some jurisdictions, individuals can still find themselves behind bars for willfully unpaid criminal fees. This is a vestige of the old debtors' prisons, a ghost from the past that haunts our current legal landscape. This system has undeniable impacts on contemporary society. It creates a cycle of debt and imprisonment that can be difficult to break, disproportionately affecting those who are already financially disadvantaged. This lingering shadow of debtors' prisons can lead to a perpetual cycle of poverty and incarceration, raising questions about fairness and justice in our modern world. Indeed, the legacy of debtors' prisons is a complex one. It's a reminder of a harsh past, a lesson on the evolution of our legal systems, and a challenge for us to ensure fairness and justice for all. Though largely abolished, the shadow of debtors' prisons lingers in some aspects of our modern justice systems.